Welcome to another episode of CP Talks with Trey. I'm your host, Trey Morehouse. Today's episode is going to be a lot about ignorance and assumptions. What I mean by that is when you have a disability, you get assumptions all the time. And mainly it's due to ignorance. People will assume that you're not able to communicate, or you're not able to express your desires simply because you're disabled. And that really has to do a lot with ignorance and just not having exposure to disability. So I'm hoping to change that, even a little bit. I can think of multiple occasions throughout my life where I have been with friends or family, and they have spoken to my family members about me when they really should have addressed me directly, because they assumed, I'm assuming, that I wasn't able to communicate my desires, like saying things, would he like this, and this, rather than addressing me directly and saying, would you like this, and this? Or if we're at a restaurant, what would he like to drink? Rather than addressing me directly and saying, what would you like to drink? I can think of one incident a couple years ago, going back to the restaurant theme, where I was with my cousins. We were at a restaurant, and the waitress turned to my cousin and asked her, is he old enough to drink? I had ordered alcohol, rather than asking me for my ID and asking me if I was old enough to drink, which is what the waitress should have done. At that point, I spoke up and informed her that I was able to speak for myself, and that yes, I was able to drink. Let me just get my ID. And then I proceeded to hand her my ID. Basically, it just comes down to that misconception, that assuming that people can't communicate simply because they're disabled. It has something that has irked me most of my life. Or people assume that you can't hear because you're physically disabled. One has nothing to do with the other. And unless you're specifically told otherwise by another individual, or the signs are clearly obvious that the person cannot communicate, we should assume that they can communicate. We should assume that they can communicate, and we should make that the norm, rather than making it the norm to assume that they can't. Assuming that somebody can't communicate is very dehumanizing. I call it dehumanizing because I don't really know what else to call it. It makes me feel, as I'm sure it does with other people who have a similar condition, that they aren't human, that they're less than human because they're treated as less than human by you assuming that they can't communicate. Or if somebody in a wheelchair is in your way, you will simply move them out of your way without asking permission, which is incredibly rude. That would be no different than shoving a person out of your way, but somehow society has called that normal because it's a chair. Well, no, it's not a chair, it's my legs. And debasing me and others who are in a wheelchair down to mere objects is dehumanizing. So that's another area I wanted to touch on today. Just basically the theme of today's episode comes down to respect. You should respect everybody. Don't assume that one can't communicate. Don't touch a wheelchair without permission. And just basically give everybody, disabled or not disabled, common human decent respect. Respect is the key here. And respect should be something that everybody strives to achieve. Thank you for listening. This has been Trey Morehouse with CP Talks with Trey, brought to you by My CP and Me, L.L.C. Until next time, good night, and remember, respect everyone. Respect is the key.